Hi everyone. I'm just letting a few more people come in, but I'm gonna get started with the introductions for now. So yeah, thanks all for coming today for our core hub and the GGR program webinar on monitoring, reporting, and verification of greenhouse gas removals. Today we have a speaker, Natasha Martirosian, who's a researcher within the Core Hub. She works in my team at University of Bristol, but she also heads up the Flex Fund at the University of Oxford. So she's got multiple roles in Core that reflect her multiple skills. She's going to talk a bit more detail about MRV and some of the work we've been doing for about 15 minutes. And then we have three respondents. We've got Jess Looy-Hyde, who's head of GGR standards within DESNZ. Then we'll hear from Rob Brown, who's a carbon removal scientist at Isometric, and then who works very much and can represent the voluntary carbon markets. And then Harley Stoddart, who's head of climate science at Defra. And each of those is going to respond for about 4 or 5 minutes. And then we should hopefully then have plenty of time for questions and answers. So please do put your question answers in the question answer box. And also please do feel free to vote up questions you like. And that will help me choose questions at the end, although I won't entirely base it on the voting because I know questions that come in later tend to have fewer votes. So do get your questions in. And I shall now hand over to Natasha to give her talk.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And thank you, Joe, for that introduction. Really looking forward to presenting today and then hearing our respondents and getting some really interesting questions from the group. I'm just going to share my screen. And I hope everyone can see the presentation, the main page. Today, we are talking about MRV. So MRV in a global context. As Joe mentioned, my name is Natasha Martirosian. I work with a team in Bristol at the University of Bristol, researching, monitoring, reporting, and verification and socio-ecological systems. So CORE has been running since 2021, and over the course of this time, they've developed, it was a cross-cutting group of scientists have developed the core evaluation framework and the principles of MRV, which are accuracy, transparency, consistency, comparability, and completeness. Greenhouse gas removal must be net negative across the whole life cycle, which is cradle to grave, not project time frame. And beyond carbon is as important for public acceptability. Environmental, social co-benefits and trade-offs need to be measured across the whole life cycle. And consistent comparable MRV and regulations across different CDR or GGR types will inform decision-making. So I can't say this word, interoperability of data and tools create a level playing field across technologies. So we have a rapidly evolving landscape of MRV protocols and standards, which is currently dominated by the voluntary carbon market. Developers and registries work independently with little transparency, but we can see that that is slowly starting to change. But the majority still isn't as transparent as we should hope. National and international regulations, legislation, and frameworks are quite time consuming, as Department of Energy and Net Zero and Defra can tell you. But what we can see is that from 2021, there's been an influx of MRV protocols, and some are for technologies that are newly emerging. They haven't been around for a very long time, and they're not necessarily well understood. We don't have long-term field trials to tell us how they will do in the natural world. So let's put this into the UK context. Right now, we have the nature market's overarching principles and framework specification from earlier this year, and a consultation for voluntary carbon and nature markets to raise integrity from early last spring, actually. And these sit within Defra's responsibility. And Department of Energy and Net Zero focus on engineered removals, and this summer developed the minimum quality thresholds for bioenergy with carbon capture and storage and direct air carbon capture and storage. Currently in development are the full standards and methodologies for power BECCS and DACs. And next on the list look to be biochar and enhanced rock weathering. Now, these are the expertise of our respondents, and I'll let them speak to their expertise when it comes to responding to what we've said today. One thing to note is that enhanced rock weathering and biochar don't fall neatly within a nature-based or engineered solution category. So how we divvy up the process and responsibility, how it looks for project developers and farmers, and if it's representative to all parties involved is still a question. Now, in a global context, we have Article 6.4 and the IPCC. We have the EU CRCF, which is also emerging. And the EU CRCF recently drafted methodologies for permanent removals in BECCS, DACs, and biochar. They're currently consulting on enhanced rock weathering and ocean alkalinity enhancement. And to provide a timely evidence to the UK decision makers and BSI and to other stakeholders, and also to respond to the recent CRCF consultation that closed in the autumn, the Core Hub conducted a comparative analysis between 3 sets of international standards and approaches to BECCS and DACs. So the CRCF is to support the EU ETS, and is, a regional framework. The ICVCM are high integrity principles for the voluntary carbon market, which we really need to emphasize the voluntary. It is optional participation. It encompasses all GGR technologies. And in the context of the UK, in the recent carbon and nature markets consultation, the UK government asked experts to share their opinion on whether or not the UK should endorse the ICVCM as a minimum quality principle. And of course, there's Article 6.4 that is meant to support project-based carbon trading in the Paris Agreement. So this is a really international, broad approach to GGRs globally. And it is inclusive of all GGR technologies. Before we get into the results of how this comparative analysis, of the results of this comparative analysis and our findings, it is something to note that across all 3 approaches, there are inconsistent terminologies. So we've really tried to look at those and understand what that means. Something to note for everybody watching is that this analysis should be available for, it should be published in a couple weeks time, maybe a week, hopefully, but a preprint is available. So if you contact me directly via email, we can send that over to you ASAP. So first we'd like to talk about permanence and fungibility. Biological systems are transient. Capacity is impacted by future climate scenarios, and geological storage is thousands of years and beyond, 1,000 years and beyond. Engineered removals and storage are more straightforward, and biological solutions can be really challenging to untangle. The anthropogenic and natural drivers, soil chemistry interactions are quite complex. Uncertainty, everything is project specific and can be controversial. The paper that was published late 2024 in Nature refers to the geological net zero and need for disaggregated accounting for carbon sinks. It was written by several very brilliant scientists, including Joe House, our chair today. And the recommendations and findings are that, only geological removals are fungible with fossil extraction, and that biological removals are still essential for biological emissions. They're cheaper, they already exist, and there are nature benefits. And I would add social benefits. But how we use them in the short term to build in long-term safeguards is still a question at hand. So, talking about permanence in the results of our review, permanence we found is not defined as a fixed number, but as risk of reversal. So the aim is to calculate risk, minimize, and potentially compensate for in some scenarios. CRCF assumes that CCS is essentially permanent. Wood stored in products is reversed after 35 years, neither of which can be proven to be true at this moment. The ICVCM has a 40-year monitoring period, maybe set up to 100 years in the future. But for CCS, they also assume essential permanence. Article 6.4 requires continuous monitoring until proof of negligible risk. So you can see a snapshot here of a table that we have in our results for the review, and that is the approach to permanence and risk reversal. You can see that all three of these approaches are aligned. As you can see, there's a green, which means that there is full alignment, and that DACs and BECs have very low or no risk of carbon release, but still require risk reversal assessments. Monitoring and mitigation of avoidable and unavoidable risks during crediting periods, and post-credit assessment of reversal risk. Methods are detailed in the CCS directive. They are aligned, but we do feel that the ICVCM and the CRCF could adopt more detailed approaches and methods that are presented in Article 6.4, and that the CRCF specifies and provides methods for risk reversal compensatory mechanisms via buffer fold insurance, potentially using Article 6.4's risk assessment tool. Baselines and additionality in the VCM. So I'm going to go over this slide quite quickly. Essentially, technology drives methodology for baselines and additionality in the VCM. And many prefer a zero baseline, with nature-based solutions preferring business as usual and performance benchmark baselines. A majority use financial testing combined with legal barrier analysis for additionality testing. So there's a real need for market confidence, and standards are should actively align their methodologies and quality criteria to the emerging requirements of Article 6.4. In the context of our research, you can see another snapshot of our results table. And you can see in this one, there's a lot of yellow and a lot of red. So everything is, the comparative analysis is ICVCM in Article 6.4 against the CRCF. And we've RAG rated the CRCF, and you can see a lot of yellow. So there's no regulatory additionality testing or prior consideration in the CRCF. It lacks detailed justification of methodologies, methodological choices, and consideration of uncertainties. Zero baseline assumptions are made, and cascading biomass principles are used for sustainability. So there are no strict environmental safeguards, and it's assumed to minimize leakage, which is not actually calculated. So a more detailed approach can be found in ICVCM. and Article 6.4, or even the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And calculating project baselines in a more rigorous direct evaluation of leakage throughout would be beneficial. Support could come through an independent advisory body or monitoring body to assist with verification and calculation of baselines. So we have next to talk about accuracy versus pragmatism. An accurate, detailed approach, a gold standard approach, which is consequential and very comprehensive, versus pragmatic. It's not overly burdensome. It's attributional potentially. It's great for voluntary carbon market. And it's where you look at the minimum best practice or the minimum standard. Common but differentiated methods and uncertainties depending on technology sector, producer, and end user. We could look at a tiered approach where there are requirements according to the impact that the project will have. Is there a higher carbon price for a gold standard? What does that look like? Could we reduce and insure against risks and uncertainties through conservative estimates and insurance buffers? There are benefits and risks to both. Developing standards and methodologies are time-consuming and complex. Focusing on key technologies allows rapid development, and but a level playing field of evaluation criteria can better inform decision makers about what technologies to prioritize and invest in. Focusing on some technologies first or across separate processes risks lack of comparability. So there's a real balance that is required here. I'm quite aware of time, so I'm going to skip over. We're almost at 15 minutes. So sustainability in the VCM. The voluntary carbon market uses words like shall do no harm principles without definitions. There's inconsistency in self-reporting of sustainable development goals, and there's no verification or MRV. But if we look at the way that Article 6.4 addresses sustainability, you see that there's a mandatory sustainable development tool. It includes risk assessments and impact evaluations. The ICVCM is quite stringent, but has no MRV attached to environmental and social safeguards, and the CRCF uses cascading biomass principles and associated member state regulations. So we really need to set baselines for sustainability indicators across a full life cycle assessment. So the next steps are IPCC developing their methodology report on CDR technologies, carbon capture and utilization and storage, and national greenhouse gas inventories. But this is interesting because they will be updating for gaps in existing guidelines or new removal technologies that have emerged. They're updating for biochar, CCUS, and soil carbon, and enhanced rock weathering is to be added as an amendment for soil carbon. Nowhere do we see anything on ocean alkalinity enhancement. That's been omitted right now, and probably for very good reason, as many of us know. But the EU is exploring an ocean alkalinity enhancement. So there's some misalignments here. We need more data from expanded long-term field trials across a range of environmental conditions, and we need robust methodologies with clear definitions of baseline system boundary, monitoring, and performance timescales. I'm going to leave you with a couple of take-home messages, which are that urgency requires learning by doing, which is what is being attempted by ICVCM and CRCF. And transparency is going to build credibility. We need to embed flexibility to avoid stifling innovation, but continuing to raise credibility, accuracy, equity, and include new science. Rewarding early adopters is very important for transparency. and data sharing and methods sharing. And we don't want to let perfect be the enemy of the good, but through honest transparency, that has to be good enough. Thank you so much. I know I'm a little bit over, so I'm just going to stop sharing.
Thanks, Natasha.
back
And
to
that's
Jim.
because I was quite short in my bit, so we're more or less on time, so we did perfectly. Thank you very much. And just to say that the IPCC nominations for authors is open for anyone interested, and I'm happy. I'm probably going to self-nominate, but I'm also happy to chat to anyone who might want to nominate, and we can share the link for that in the background document. So I'm going to hand straight over to Jess from DESNZ.
Great, thank you, Joe and Natasha. Yes, so I'm Jess from DESNZ. I'm head of GGR standards in the department. I wanted to start by responding to say we really care about this issue. Like a robust GGR standard, including MRV, we think is going to be crucial to preserving the integrity of any market for negative greenhouse gas emissions, and instilling that public and investor confidence that removals are genuine and that they're verifiable. So I think Natasha mentioned that last year, as hopefully many of you know, the government commissioned BSI to develop and engineered a greenhouse gas removal standard. So yes, this was focused on DACs and BECs initially. And under the first phases of that contract, BSI defined and published methodological minimum quality thresholds. You can find those on the BSI website. So these are the minimum thresholds for those early GGR projects seeking support from one of the government's business models, so the funding support from government. So now, again, as Natasha mentioned, we are working with BSI to think about the next phase of methodological development. So we are intending, and we have asked BSI to set out detailed GGR methodologies for UK projects by 2027. And this next phase is really going to build on the work that they've already undertaken in the past year, and all of the feedback that we've had from stakeholders. But crucially, and we announced this recently, we are seeking to align wherever possible and appropriate for the UK context with the EU's Carbon Removals and Carbon Farming Directive and Permanent Carbon Removal Delegated Act. That's a mouthful. So I guess why have we decided now in phase 2 to harmonise with the CRCF, as it's called, where it makes sense to do so for us in the UK? Well, I suppose it's partly because when we started our work with BSI, the CRCF had not published their detailed methodologies. It wasn't that clear what positions they were going to take, and we really wanted to get ahead of the game to support those early GGR projects. But of course, since then, as many of you will know, the EU has made significant progress in developing methodologies for permanent carbon removals. And actually, the minimum quality thresholds that BSI have published align pretty well with those EU methodologies. And actually, the EU methodologies have, in a significant part, I think, been developed to the level of detail required for us and UK projects. So again, I'm sure many of you would agree and support avoiding duplication and divergence in standards. So there's lots of benefits in having commonality and fungibility between standards. It supports the development of a good kind of thriving removals market in the long run. And the UK ETS authority intends to align standards and methodologies for engineered GGR operators under the UK ETS with UK GGR methodologies and standards. So we see this as a significant step, I guess, towards an agreed definition of removal carbon credits across both compliance and voluntary markets, which we think stakeholders will support and they have called for. So just to go back to the BSI standard development process, just to say a little bit more. The reason we are working closely with BSI on this is because we believe that they generate high integrity standards or sort of benchmarks, and they work in a consensus-based approach, so they leverage expertise from academia, from industry specialists. They work with us very closely as policymakers throughout the design process of the methodologies, and they will continue to do that in this next phase. So just turning to the work that Natasha just talked us through. So this comparative analysis of CRCF, ICBCM, core carbon principles and Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement, for us is very timely, and it's a really important independent piece of work that we are considering very carefully as we plan this next phase of methodological development. I would urge you to read it. It is very comprehensive and informative. And, you know, in our standards development work, we are, of course, seeking to uphold the integrity principles outlined in the UK government BCNN consultation. And we have indicated that we're minded to endorse the ICBCM core carbon principles as a minimum requirement. And that is aligned with our colleagues in Defra, who also wish to align with that best practice, if you like. So the report, I think the detail has been very helpful for us. We're still digesting some of the content. I think the critique of those key areas of additionality, baseline, leakage and permanence, and I suppose where the CRCF could be strengthened when compared to something like ICBCM and Article 6.4 has given us a lot of food for thought, and will really, I think, help us consider or balance where we might want to consider diverging from the CRCF position on some areas and why. And I wanted to sort of end my response by just making a general point about working with academia. I think in government, we find it extremely helpful. Your research kind of forms some of the evidence to help us in our policy design. So it's through reports like the one that CORE have produced that really help us be better informed, I suppose, make more evidence-based policy decisions, and other avenues as well that I find helpful are things like joint workshops. And I think, you know, building these sorts of relationships with academia is really great, and sort of aligning the research agendas with policy needs in the long term can help also enhance their impact. So thank you to the team for all your hard work, and I'll just finish there, I think.
Thanks, Jess. I was going to tell you needed to finish, but then you were saying nice things about us, so I let you carry on for a minute. Handing over to Rob from Isometric.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Really interesting so far, and hopefully the questions will add to that as well. Just to give a quick kind of quick pitch on Isometric, because I appreciate not everybody will have come across us before. We were founded in 2022 as a carbon registry and standard, so we sit between suppliers and buyers of carbon credits. We have 17 protocols covering a range of pathways at the moment, and 5 of them have been ICVCM approved for core carbon principle labeling, and we also have several others in review with them at the moment as well. We tend to develop protocols in-house, so we have a 20-strong team of in-house scientists covering pretty much all of those pathways, and access to 300 scientists in our science network, as well as kind of other stakeholders that we bring in if we need extra expertise in a particular area. And yeah, we do consider kind of the baseline additionality and leakage specifically as well. And I think so I previously worked on the biochar demonstrator project. I think the work that was done on that project was fantastic, and the other demonstrators as well. But I do think sometimes we might not take stock of kind of all the science that is out there already. So I did a quick Google this morning. I mean, biochar is my kind of specialism, the thing that I work on daily, and there are 17,000 publications on biochar and soil interactions at the moment. And yet we're always talking about you know, needing to know more. And I think sometimes it's quite nice to take a step back realize what we do know and kind of formulate some kind of pivotal research questions moving forward, rather than just keep on exploring, you know, for the sake of it almost. I'm very interested in the BSI standards, and I'm interested in what that will mean for the VCM. I think certainly from my experience, I've been with Isometric for 6 months now. Standards are not static, you know, that they are constantly evolving in time, and there's more evidence and scientific thinking becoming available, you know, because of these 17,000 papers that have been published. And I think having something that is possibly set, you know, 27 was mentioned as the date that they'd be kind of scoped by. But these things will keep evolving over time, and I think that's where possibly standards and registries like ourselves, who are kind of constantly updating our methodology to in line with the latest scientific thinking, might kind of fit in there. On MRV specifically, I'll probably speak most on biochar, because that's the pathway I know best, and it's possibly one of the easiest pathways to do good and robust MRV on. Durability is of the biochar can be modeled on the creation of the biochar, and there are also some other like chemical and geological proxies that you can be used to kind of estimate stability over time. Obviously, in all cases, we should be using conservative assumptions. We don't want to be over-crediting, because that completely undermines the efforts and kind of erodes the standards and voluntary carbon market as an industry. But that being said, I think once biochar is applied into soil, it's very, very difficult to then pick the biochar organic carbon from soil organic carbon. So that MRV over time, once actually in its storage location, if we're talking about soil, is very, very difficult. The other thing I just wanted to touch on was transparency, and I think that is really key. I think for too long it's not often been transparent as to how carbon dioxide is removed for each specific pathway or specific removal for each credit. I think there is a move in the voluntary carbon market to try and make things more transparent. Our platform is completely transparent down to the calculation. You can literally click into all of the kind of underlying numbers that then lead into that final calculation. And yeah, I just wanted to possibly finish on markets don't have to be bad. I think there's a lot to be said for markets. I recently was at a conference in Germany, and there was a Brazilian politician there, and he was basically saying that markets will be around forever, whereas governments come and go, and you get these policy changes and kind of the winds of policy. Whereas if there is kind of potentially financial incentive in these markets, then hopefully there will also be good things done, but they have to be right. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Rob. And just to say, we don't consider you a sellout for having left academia and got into markets, so you're all right. We're friends with industry as well as government, I hope. Just a quick reminder before Harley's talk to put your questions into the chat, and handing over to you, Harley. Sorry, put questions in the Q&A box, not the chat. Sorry, Harley, carry on.
No, that's quite all right. I was going to say, and maybe also a reminder to me not to waffle on for quite too long, because I really, really can. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Harley Stoddart, Head of Climate Mitigation Science at Defra. And of course, Defra is interested in those GGRs, which are, the nature-based ones. So we're interested in the biochar, we're interested in enhanced rock weathering, because that's likely to be applied to soils, the perennial energy crops, the peats, and the trees. And because these are complex biological systems, the carbon dioxide removal, the carbon capture from these sorts of technologies does tend to be transient. It's mobile, and thereby it is at risk of reversal. But that's okay, because we have the ability to measure things. And, for a carbon market, whether it's a voluntary carbon market, a regulated carbon market, or anything else, I kind of think two things are really important, but they're kind of the same thing, really. It's comfort and confidence. It's comfort and confidence that whomsoever is buying a credit can be assured that the positive impact is being had from the payment of that credit, that additionality that Rob was talking about. I think one of the really good things about the nature-based side of things and the more biological side of things is, yes, there's a carbon dioxide removal, there's that carbon sequestration, that but there also tends to be other benefits as well. And it's these other environmental co-benefits that just sort of strengthen almost the value of that carbon. Not in a literal sense. I'm not saying that a carbon credit for biochar is going to be worth more because of other co-benefits, but in a future world where we have stacked benefits, of carbon and other natural capital aspects, then it may well be. And whether it's biochar or whether it's enhanced rock weathering or trees or peat or whatever it is, these co-benefits are often impacting positively on air quality, water quality, habitats, and biodiversity. And Natasha mentioned it at the beginning. We have to try and provide enough robust evidence to provide that comfort and confidence, whilst at the same time avoiding letting perfect be the enemy of the good. We can't afford to procrastinate. We know enough and we know a lot about what we can do now, and that's what we need to drive forwards. However, I do think there are certain aspects of certain technologies here that we still want to investigate further. So, as Rob said, biochar, and he knows biochar inside, up, and out. And it's there for an awfully long time. We're still digging up biochar from, the Stone Age and probably earlier. However, there are some things that, from an agricultural soils point of view, or just a wider land management point of view, we will want to know and understand as well. So things like, how does biochar lock up nutrients? And in what circumstances is that beneficial and reduces diffuse pollution? And where might it actually be slightly problematic and impact on a farmer's ability to provide the appropriate crop nutrient management to a crop? Likewise with enhanced rock weathering, really exciting area. Magic rock dust. Who doesn't love a bit of magic rock dust, right? And we know, rather blithely, I think we understand the geochemistry of the carbon dioxide removal quite well. It's going to work better in some soils than others, and we need to work out which those are and be able to map where they are in order to have that potential, because it doesn't have the same carbon dioxide removal everywhere. Okay. In fact, I'd argue it's going to work significantly better in the tropics than it is in the UK, but it will work here in the UK as well. But we need to understand how much and in what circumstances and in what locations. But at the same time, we also want to understand, applying this ground up rock dust material to soils, what, if any, impact is that likely to have on soil biology? Okay. And in fact, do we know whether it has a positive or negative impact on the crop agronomy as well? These are questions that we still want to be able to answer before we start applying, lots of this material to the land. You don't want to get into a situation where we look back and go, maybe we shouldn't have been so eager. But we know a lot. We're going to know more. And, it's a very exciting area. So I'll stop there and hopefully people will have some questions.
Thanks, Harley. That was perfectly on time. So there are two questions so far in the chat. Both have been answered actually, but I wanted to come back on Sebastian Engelmann's question about more clarification on how enhanced rock weathering is dealt with in the IPCC, because I quickly read the scoping document last night, and I know Natasha and Harley have answered it in some ways, but I just wanted to answer it very much from an IPCC methods development perspective, having been involved in those in the past. Is at the moment, the scoping document is quite light on detail. All it's saying is enhanced rock weathering will be in the section that already exists on soil carbon. It's not sort of saying how it should be dealt with as a soil amendment or the methods. I imagine it would have a quite separate set of methods to the methods already in use for assessing soil carbon and the emissions factors and things like that. It's just that's where it seems to sit well in the agriculture, forestry and other land use section of the report that exists, because the 2006 guidelines will stay as the 2006 guidelines. This new report will sit alongside those. It won't reopen the whole guidelines. So in that sense, it's got to find somewhere to shove all the different bits. So enhanced rock weathering is shoved under soil with no pre-definition of how that will look, and that will be up to the authors. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything else on that point.
Only to say, Joe, I completely agree with you. I think that's where it's been mentioned. It's not suggesting it's the same thing.
Yeah, so I think it's still very, very, it's all still open to the authors on what that looks like when it goes in, what the methods will be, and really critically sort of what the uncertainties will be, because IPCC requires uncertainty calculation. So I think that will be quite an interesting one. Okay, Nikki Brazola asked Natasha for some clarification on the on the particular study we did, and I know Natasha, you have answered that partially, but I wondered if you wanted to just expand on that a bit more, particularly in terms of CRCF, ICVCM, and Article 6.4. How much did they actually drill down to detailed methods, and how much not?
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, so it was really interesting to conduct this research because although there are detailed methodologies, for example, in the CRCF, there's reference to different delegated acts which dictate how CCS, for example, is treated through the CCS directive. Or the cascading, excuse me, I saw something blowing in the wind. The cascading biomass principles are meant to ensure sustainability of biomass procurement and minimize leakage. But these are principles that are not yet in effect. And so they're not being practiced in such a way that we can trust that the outcome will be what is intended. And so the CRCF has a methodology that requires you to look through many, many, many different delegated acts so that you can understand what is happening and what is being asked of a project developer. I find that quite challenging. And in the ICVCM, everything is laid out really clearly. It's you know, an assessment framework that is quite detailed, even if in some ways can be developed further and improved over time. But you get a real clear idea. You get a really clear idea of what is being asked of a project and what is required. Whereas in CRCF, it's difficult to know if you're just a regular person who's not sitting and analyzing this for several months of your life. And then contrasting with Article 6.4, which is quite detailed, there are tools for assessment of risk. There are tools for assessment of sustainability, sustainable development goals. There are reference point for which you can say, okay, this is how I need to achieve my goals. And so with challenges in terminology that I mentioned earlier, and you know, having slightly different purposes, Article 6.4 is a global top-down framework, whereas CRCF is for the European Union only. And for example, when we have our standards developed, will be UK specific. And so throughout the process, we found different language available for different methodologies. And that's just the nature of the fact that they were developed for different purposes in reality. But then it goes back to what Jess said, is that we need to have comparability. We need to develop a globally understood framework that can be adopted. And Article 6.4 is the best starting point. Aligning with 6.4 means that you've aligned with the global nationally declared contributions. You are aligned with a treaty that's been signed by many, many countries. I hope that answers the question and goes into a little bit more detail on what we did and why.
Thanks, Natasha. I'm going to bundle two of the newer questions together, which is one about have there been any guidelines exploring algal grown for carbon sequestration, and also the direction of travel for DOCC, direct ocean carbon capture, is that? So I will, if I, just from a IPCC perspective, they are not in, and we didn't come across them in anything in our analysis, but I wonder if any of the panel has any further thoughts on either of those two questions. So I think that's no, I'm not sure. I mean, I think whether there's much in the voluntary carbon market, Rob, particularly on either of those.
So we do have a direct ocean capture protocol. I have to say I've not been involved in it, so I can't really speak on it particularly. Purpose-grown feedstock, so things like growing algae specifically for carbon sequestration is something we're exploring at the moment. But generally at the moment, we are looking for residues and not wastes, of course, not wastes, but residues of processes, because the counterfactual argument and market leakage is much smaller. So yes, something we're actively thinking about, these kind of purpose-grown feedstocks, for example, algae, for carbon removal, but not something that we currently allow.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Harley, we've got a question for you on enhanced rock weathering. It works better in some soils, and could you elaborate on the key factors for that, please?
Yes and no. Thanks, Kato, for the question. Yes, the carbon dioxide removal, the geochemistry, is pH dependent. So the pH of the soils is quite critical to how well it works and where it works. However, trying to narrow down what pH range is optimal for carbon dioxide removal in UK soils is proving a little tricky at the moment. And that's to do with not just the pH of the soil that you're applying to, but also the underlying soil profile as well. So, we have further research ongoing at the moment looking into this.
Thanks, Harley. And I noticed that Lewis has helpfully put in the questions that the European Commission, to go back to DOC, will hold a technical workshop on that in the spring. And also to say that just last month, they did also hold a workshop on enhanced rock weathering and ocean alkalinity enhancement to see if they were suitable for taking forward. I don't know what the outcome of that, but IPCC decided for the moment not to take forward any ocean methods. The methods, there's nothing on oceans at all in the IPCC methods for national greenhouse gas accounting, and that could be a whole separate discussion on why and the issues with that. And but we won't go into that now unless anyone's super keen. A question from Kato, another one from Kato, thank you. What do the panelists see as being the main issues with sustainably sourcing feedstock for biochar production? Rob, I'm going to head that one straight to you, if I may, and then let Harley and Jess come in if they want.
Yeah, absolutely. So understanding the baseline of what would happen to that feedstock is obviously very key in understanding how much carbon actually is going to be removed. If you've got something that is going to be stably stored in the environment and you're taking it away to try and stably store it in the environment in a different way, there's literally no point in doing that. And that's not an additional practice. So I think, yeah, additionality is key, baselining is key. Understanding market leakage is also key. So if you're shifting the market away from say food production to then grow something that is available for biochar production, that's obviously not great, and you need to account for those emissions, and at which point it's likely that, you know, squaring off the LCA and everything like that, your carbon removal will not be a carbon removal. So again, there's little point in doing it in the first place. Yes, as I say, it is something we're actively thinking about. We generally allow residues at the moment, but are considering possibly purpose-grown feedstocks. But these things would have to be kind of thought about and accounted for if we do go down that pathway.
Thanks, Rob. Natasha.
Hi, I just wanted to bring to everyone's attention the biochar regulation in the UK policy briefing, a wasteful approach to greenhouse gas removal from June 2025. It was led, I believe, by Navraj and Luca. And it's quite interesting because it really talks about how waste regulation can make bio feedstock procurement challenging, and that the UK really needs to revisit some of the ways in which we define waste so that we can create a more circular system of our waste. And biochar may be a solution to that. So I would urge people to have a quick Google search, or I don't know if we can provide that link to everybody, but it's on the core website. But if you just type core biochar waste regulation, it will take you straight to the PDF, and it's only 11 pages, including a cover page. So it's a quick read, and I would recommend it.
Thanks, Natasha. Harley.
Yes, thanks. Following on nicely, really, I think we need to disaggregate a little bit and think about not all biochar is equal, and we've got different potential uses for biochar as well. So often in my world, when people mention biochar, they think about spreading it to agricultural land, but actually biochar can go into an awful lot of other materials as well. So we might and we will have very stringent criteria with regards to what material can be applied to agricultural land that is going to be producing our food. However, and on that, you know, with regards to sustainability, the life cycle analysis will always determine whether it is how much more sustainable is one feedstock into one particular use than another. And you know, we're never going to do something which doesn't come out in a positive way. Okay, so we can waste quite a lot of material and quite a lot of energy to end up with something that makes things worse. We're not doing that. Okay. But there are lots of feedstocks out there, which might already be waste feedstocks or surplus feedstocks, that can go into production of concrete or tarmac. Okay, they are perhaps a lower value but larger volume market potentially, and then we might want to preserve, you know, the better quality, the higher quality feedstocks to produce biochar that then applies to land. You know, I'm also quite intrigued with where else can biochar be of benefit as well as being a good carbon store. Because again, to remind people, you know, with biochar, the point of carbon dioxide removal is at photosynthesis. The biochar is about the storage of that carbon and not releasing it back to the atmosphere.
Thanks, Harley. Just to say, Lewis in the chat has offered to share the scoping for the enhanced the enhanced weathering and OAE consultants report before that commission's meeting last month and has shared his email. Rob, did you want to come back to Harley?
Yeah, just very briefly, I completely agree, Harley. But what I will say is monitoring and measuring those co-benefits is often more difficult than actually monitoring the kind of the carbon removal. So frameworks for that, I think, are also very important. And again, it's something we're actually thinking about internally. But yeah, I'd be very interested in maybe hearing your thoughts at some point.
Right. So Cato has asked a question in the chat about farmers' attitudes. And I was actually, when I was thinking about asking a question to all of you about looking at things from different lenses. When we were writing our report, DESNZ were very keen. We wrote it from a very much an academic perspective and high integrity. But obviously, there's a lot of different stakeholders here that government bodies are listening to. You're listening to us as academics, you're listening to industry like Isometric, you're listening to farmers. So I wonder if we could go around and finish off with some round-up comments on different perspectives and how they're all balanced in terms of considering GGR, both by government and also by industry. That would be great. Thanks. Who wants to talk about that first? Harley.
Nothing shy to talk. Yeah, I mean, we want to have confidence in the quantifiable benefit of what it is that we're doing, but it's not at all and any cost. And so there is the sort of which industry is going to be doing this? What's the cost of doing it? What's the benefit to them? What are the co-benefits to them? But there's also then the wider societal thing. So, Cato, you put in the Q&A about enhanced rock weathering and farmers' attitude. So I'm just going to use that as a bit of an example. You know, so the work of the research has done lots and really good social science engagement as well. You know, so what are policymakers interested in? What is wider public's attitude? What are local communities' attitudes to, as well as to the farmers? And farmers being farmers, wonderful industry, nothing so diverse as agriculture. Some of them are for, and some of them are still waiting to see. You know, they already apply lime to change the pH of their soil, and some of that lime could be replaced. So instead of using limestone crushed up, they could be using enhanced rock weathering. So some of them are very open to it. Others are concerned that they'll be the ones who are having to need to do something for other people to cash in on. So it's a mixed bag. But we need to take into consideration all quarters of society.
Thanks, Harley. And Jess, and keep it brief because we're nearly at time. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I was just going to add, I totally agree with you, Harley. I was just going to add a comment about a couple of the recommendations following the GGR review, the independent GGR review, was also about sort of more collaborative working across government, so establishing an office for GGRs and a cross-government GGR strategy. And I absolutely think there are areas where DESNZ and Defra in particular could work more closely and be more coordinated. And I think that will create, I suppose, better policy coherence. It's always something that we're striving for. But in particular around, I was just thinking in terms of biochar is a good example of that, but also around public engagement. I think Defra have been doing a lot more of that, and there's a lot we could probably learn from them and implement within DESNZ. So I think, yeah, within government, there are areas where we can definitely strive to improve as well.
Okay, that's brilliant. And I was going to ask you about that thought as the government office, so I'm glad you brought that up. But mostly now, I wanted to thank everyone for coming. We're at time now. This talk's been recorded, so we'll send out around the link later. Maybe when we send around the link, we can send a link for our document, or just get in touch with me and Natasha directly about that. So yeah, brilliant. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks so much to all our speakers.